Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the CoC All-Staff Training, September 17th, 2020. Thank you so much for being here first thing on a Friday morning. I know trainings on Fridays can sometimes be a little tough, but we appreciate you hanging in there on this week with us, and hopefully this is a fun way to kind of begin the end of the week here. Lauren, do you mind keeping an eye on the waiting room and letting people in? Thank you. Okay, just a few things before we begin. I wanted to just go over the introduction. So in a few minutes, we'll kick off with an introduction to the CHIP process. We'll follow that with a brief overview of the equal access rule. We'll take a break. Then we're going to have a session on anti-discrimination and leases with Callie Dendrinos and Tish Lee from Legal Services. Then we're going to take another break, and we're going to have some housing-focused case management with Aubrey Patino from Avalon Housing, and then close with some diversion with David Kahana from the shelter. So that's the plan for today. Feel free, if some of all of this isn't quite relevant, feel free to drop in or out. We're also, as I believe everybody was notified when you came in, we're recording this, so it'll be available later on. I want to just give a huge thank you to our presenters. We have such a wealth of local talent and knowledge, and it's wonderful that they agreed to share some of it here. So just a big shout out to everyone, Lauren, Callie, Tish, Aubrey, and David. We couldn't do this without you, and we appreciate you so much. Thank you. Yeah, and smile for the camera, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to the first training here. We'll get started. Is my screen still going? Excellent. Okay. All right, so we'll launch right in. This first session is going to be on our CHIP process, which stands for Community Housing Prioritization. And so some of you have been doing this for a while, and some of you, this information might be new. So we're kind of starting from a nobody knows anything perspective. So apologies if some of this is redundant for some of you, but we want to make sure we get the kind of basic knowledge throughout our system. So what are we talking about when we say CHIP? So in the first place, it's a committee. It's a big group of people. And that committee kind of has two specific tasks. One is maintaining a by name list of everyone experiencing homelessness. So we want to keep as up-to-date knowledge as we can on everybody who's experiencing homelessness in the county, where they are, what their housing plan is, and how we're getting them there. And then the other part that's really important is they make referrals for our permanent housing resources. So all of our resources like rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, those go through the CHIP community. And they follow our community's prioritization that we all agreed on to make referrals to those resources. So in other words, CHIP brings together our community's housing providers to prioritize our literally homeless clients based on vulnerability and need and refer them to available permanent housing resources.
Okay. So Andrew, now you're going to have to check out the waiting room while I discuss this. So how do clients engage our system when they have a housing need? I'm going to speak specifically to Category 1 clients just for the purposes of this training, but as we all know, anybody that's experiencing housing instability can follow some of these same steps. But in our community, anyone who is experiencing Category 1 homelessness can access services they're eligible by calling CoC, which is our county's HARA, and HARA stands for Housing Access and Resource Agency. Every CoC in the state is required to have one. If eligible, clients are then referred out to the appropriate staff or agency to be assessed for a shelter, to complete a shelter assessment. And one of the things that is done during that is the required common assessment tool, which currently is the SPDAT assessment. So we utilize the TASE SPDAT for transitional aged youth, the VI SPDAT for single adults, and the VIF SPDAT for families. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So how does the way our clients engage with our system correlate with the CHIP process? Once a client receives their VI SPDAT assessment, whatever variety they may have received, it needs to be entered into HMIS. It needs to be entered with the correct time and date stamp, whether it's real time, which is preferred, or backdated, and then entered into the correct program EDA. The entry of the VI SPDAT data into HMIS is imperative to the process of getting a client added to the CHIP list. Prior to the CHIP meetings, as I manage the list, I'm running a report that pulls all new TASE SPDATs or new VI SPDAT or VIF SPDAT reports, and that cultivates a list of all of the youth individuals and families that have had a SPDAT assessment entered into the system with the reporting parameters. And I always kind of overlap that to make sure I catch anybody who may have been missed. So once I have those lists, the process kind of varies depending on the population. I'm going to speak a little more to the individuals. Some real quick data elements that I look for when I am cultivating this list and collecting information about clients to add them to the by name list. Disability status and the homelessness history interview questions are like of top importance. These two elements combined help us determine chronicity at its most basic stage. There's more to it, but those are the 2 points that are looked at right up front. And this affects for individuals specifically which list they land on, and for other community or other populations, it affects the prioritization for available resources. And just a little caveat, those disability and homelessness history interview questions should always be updated at project entry. So anyone who's responsible for that, if you have any questions regarding HMIS specifics, I encourage you to reach out to your agency admin. And we can switch to the next slide. Okay, so those two data elements I just mentioned, I just thought it would be helpful to show you what that looks like in HMIS so you're kind of familiar in the context of what I'm talking about. So anybody who's familiar with entering client data and entry and exit assessments, you will recognize, yes, please ask questions in the chat. I'm sorry, thank you, Andrew. The disability sub-assessment that you see is this first picture, and that is where you would update if it is incorrect or adjust as needed, depending on what the client reports at the time of entry. And then those prior living situation questions are the homelessness history interview that I'm talking about. When adding anyone to the CHIP list, these are the data elements I'm looking at. And specifically this, where you see the number 7 months, the total number of months, that's based on their self-report, but that is where I look to see how long someone has reported experiencing homelessness and how I determine in that moment what list they, or if they're considered chronic, or for individuals, which list they're going to land on. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the lists in a moment and show you what that looks like. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so once the client's information is confirmed based on what I'm seeing in HMIS, they're placed on the appropriate list, and we separate our populations by veterans, families, and individuals. And I'm going to pull up an example of what a list without any identifying information in just a moment, but I just wanted to say an important note here. Both humans and technology are less than perfect. So we always encourage CHIP representatives prior to the meeting to please review the CHIP lists for your population and make sure that you're seeing everybody who should be on that list present on the list. I know that sometimes the report can be a little funky. I know that in the past, sometimes I've accidentally deleted a row in my spreadsheet and someone was missed, and I try my hardest. That's only happened once, but you know, we're all human and imperfect in some ways. So I just always encourage, I communicate with a couple of you on a regular basis about checking in on clients and whether they're on the list, which list they're on. So always feel free to contact me with questions regarding that. And with that, Andrew, I'm going to take over the screen share really quick. And I'm going to pull up, I made a little practice, called it a dummy list. And my daughter was very much offended that I used sort dummy to explain it. So this is what the list looks like for anybody who's not regularly in the CHIP space. I've deleted all of the identifying information, but left the columns blank. So this is where we put all of the info, and then we sort according to the prioritization for each population. So I don't need to go into too much detail, but I just thought it would be good context for those who aren't regularly in the space to see what the list looks like. This is an example of an individuals list. So I will also say for individuals, we track obviously chronic individuals, and we also keep a list of non-chronic individuals. And we've started doing this because we noticed that a lot of individuals were what we would call aging into chronicity. And that wouldn't necessarily be something that we would see as evident in HMIS. There wouldn't be a new assessment. It would just be hard to keep track of. So now we track non-chronic individuals. If they're reported with a disability, then we'll use those homelessness history interview questions I mentioned before to kind of figure out the date that they would become chronic if they don't have enough accumulated time to be considered chronic. And we put that date here. Almost every CHIP cycle, I sort this list to make sure that anybody who's aging in the month that I am working in, I'm making sure that that they have aged into chronicity, and if they have, that they're being moved over to the appropriate list. That is all that I have on that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to talk a little bit more about the meeting itself. Thank you. You're still muted.
Thank you. Just real quick, if anybody is unfamiliar, Lauren was using the term chronic there. And chronic homelessness occurs when someone with a disability has been homeless, literally homeless, for more than a year out of the past 3 calendar years. And that's important because many of our resources, particularly for individuals, are prioritized for people experiencing chronic homelessness. So I just wanted to put that out there in case anybody was kind of lost in the weeds with some of that. Thank you so much, Lauren. So I wanted to talk a little bit just about what the CHIP meetings themselves are like. So we divide our CHIP meetings into 3 populations and our by name list that way, and as Lauren mentioned, into veterans, into chronics and single adults, and into families. And the main reason we do this is because that's kind of the way our system resources are aligned. So it makes sense sort of to have the families folks talking about who's going to get the family resources and the single adults who's going to get the single adult resources. But it also helps us bring together the kind of experts in our system around those particular types of populations. Obviously, there's some overlap there. We recognize that, but this is kind of the way it's developed over the years. The goal of CHIP in every case is we want to help people exit homelessness and return to housing as quickly as possible, and then to support them and figure out how to keep them stably housed by getting them the assistance and supportive services that meet their needs. And so that can really vary depending on low needs clients who we might expect to be able to almost self-resolve, maybe with just a little light touch of helping them find some housing, all the way up to our very high needs clients who are going to need ongoing permanent support to remain housed. And so we're trying to consider the needs of all those people, and hopefully, if we can, discuss how we can get them to exit their homelessness as soon as possible. I want to talk just for a second about Built for Zero, because they've really informed our process. And so Built for Zero is a movement, you might say, of more than 80 cities and counties across the country working to end homelessness. They particularly focus on veteran and chronic homelessness because they believe if we can achieve an end to homelessness for those populations, we can take the learnings we get from that and move on to ending it for other populations like youth and families. They've been really, really helpful. We joined them in 2015, right when they started. They've been really helpful in helping us design our by name list process, so helping us design a good quality process that makes sure we capture everybody and we're getting all the data we need to make our decisions. They've been helpful in helping us refine our meeting process so that we have a good solid meeting and develop a really excellent case conferencing space. But beyond that, also helped us just to get to the CHIP space to, I think, where it is today, where everybody feels hopefully on equal footing and is able to contribute. So they've been really our thought partners throughout all of this. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about them a lot during the meetings. So who comes to CHIP? CHIP is made up of kind of everybody across our system and everybody who has a kind of hand in our coordinated entry. And specifically, we usually have one or two representatives from all these agencies come, but really, it's really important that we have the representatives from everyone. And I apologize for my dog barking in the background. That's just the thing he does. So the people coming, we have CoC, our coordinated entry, a housing access for Washtenaw County. They're the ones who generally are receiving the calls when someone's first reporting to our system, if they're not presenting at an agency. So they often have the bird's eye view of kind of where everybody is in our system, and especially are helpful in helping to talk about the people just coming into our system. We have our street outreach coming. They're there to help us keep tabs on everybody who's experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And they're wonderful at that. They do not only help us keep track of our individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness, but they also provide verification of families living outside. They just do a wonderful job. We have all our emergency shelters participating. That helps us keep tab of our clients in shelter, and hopefully also allows us to match those clients with the resources they need when they become available. On our veteran side, we have transitional housing representative, what's called grant per diem beds, GPD. Those transitional housing units are used as a bridge to housing, so they help us accelerate housing. They have one of the highest positive outcome rates in our system, actually. So they're there to help us make sure those clients are moving fast. And then finally, our permanent housing resources, our rapid rehousing, which is a short-term financial subsidy and case management that sort of phases out over time, designed to really help families or individuals get into housing, get stabilized, and then once they're on their feet, hopefully they're okay. And permanent supportive housing, which is our highest level of care. That's permanent subsidy, so permanent financial support with ongoing services matched to meet the client's specific needs. So all of these folks come together, they're all around the table working on these lists around the clients. It's really a great thing to see. So our CHIP meetings are run like many committee meetings. They're run by an agenda. I'm not going to read the agenda here, but this is sort of what one looks like. It's the upcoming meeting that's happening this Tuesday. They happen every 2 weeks, if I didn't mention, twice a month. The CHIP agenda it varies a little bit between meetings, but in general, it always includes time for by name list updates. We want to get the latest information on clients. We do a bit of that outside the meeting. So we do some of that by email. For some agencies like large shelters, we might have a separate meeting to get some of those updates. That's just to save time. But we always want the most current information on what's happening so that we can respond best. We'll have time to make referrals to any permanent housing resources that become available. Obviously, in a perfect system, we would have on-demand resources. People would come to us and we would immediately match them up with the appropriate service type and get them on their way to housing. In reality, of course, our system is extremely limited in our resources. So one of the really important things the CHIP committee does is allocate those resources according to how our communities decided to prioritize them. It's really important because our prioritization is intended to match our resources to the most vulnerable. And so it's really important that we do our best to get that right. We also have time for case conferencing. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but that's where we have a chance to talk about a client in depth and figure out maybe what our next steps can be to get them towards housing and what will remove the present barriers to housing. And then one of my favorite parts, it's really brief at the end, but we always have time for one agency to give a shout out to another agency or another set of agencies for some good work that's been going on in the system. And there's so much good stuff that's happening behind the scenes. There's so many passionate, devoted people in our system that it's always great to hear a little bit of that called out and hear about some of the good work you guys are doing out there. So I talked a bit about our referral and our prioritization. This is something that we worked out together as a community. We had a big community process. Everybody who was involved in CHIP, as well as other stakeholders, got together and we talked about how we wanted to prioritize people. The intent of our prioritization is pretty straightforward. We want to help the people who are most vulnerable and have the greatest needs first. We feel like if we focus on them, and this is kind of borne out over time, that we'll work that population down and get to people who've been easier, easier is not the right way to do it, but with less significant needs. And we've seen our acuity drop over time according to our assessment tool. Now I said it was pretty straightforward and theory. It's obviously really complicated in practice because it's difficult to pick that. So here's kind of how we determine it. I'm going to go through our different populations here. So for permanent supportive housing for individuals, the first thing we use is chronic status. So we always refer people who are experiencing chronic homelessness first. You know, people probably have mixed feelings about the chronic definition. I know I do. It's an imperfect definition, but it does help us kind of focus on those greatest at need. We also have been, since the start of the pandemic, we came together as a community and we recognize that there are specific types of folks, older people, people with certain health conditions, et cetera, who are more at risk than others for COVID-19. And so we developed a simple screening tool. It's not like based on points or anything. It's if you have any of these factors, then you're screened in to identify people who we believe were higher at risk for more complicated results from engaging COVID. We bump them up so we can house them first, because obviously it's going to be safest for them to have a space of their own. We use our VI SPDAT assessment. It's not a perfect tool. There's all sorts of issues for that. That is like a whole other webinar some other time. But we do use the VI SPDAT score to help us prioritize people. And so we go highest to lowest. And that's kind of how we do it after we look at the chronic status and the COVID-19 status. Then we take into advantage, of course, lots of people sometimes have time. So we look at a lot of other factors. So we look at mental health vulnerability, including substance use. Oftentimes, there are people whose mental health or substance use makes it impossible for them to stay safely outside or in a shelter. So if someone's in an extremely vulnerable state like that, we're going to look at housing them quickly. Also, length of time homeless. So we're going to try to prioritize people with the longest length of time. And yeah, Amanda just had a really helpful note. She's putting a bunch in there, so please check those out. Definitions of homelessness, all the community partners. Thank you so much, Amanda. For families, it looks just a little different. There's a big asterisk up there and about COVID. And so one of the things is we use our COVID status there too, but we'll take anybody in the family with a COVID at risk. We do look at chronic status. Chronic homelessness is rare among families. They don't tend to be homeless for the length of time required. Also, the definition requires the disability be in the house of the head of household. So sometimes a family might have extensive service needs because another member of the household has a disability, but that might not trigger the chronic status. We will prioritize families identified as chronic first. It doesn't always happen. We have kind of the least amount of permanent supportive housing resources for our families in our system. And so what tends to happen is families go into rapid rehousing first, even though we know like they really need permanent supportive housing. This does happen on the individual side too, but it's really like a common thing on the family side. So we actually prioritize families that are currently in rapid rehousing and really clearly have that higher level of need. And then we use these kind of other factors. So we use the SPDAT score, we use some of those vulnerabilities we talked about, and then length of time homeless. I'm gonna go back. Does anyone have any questions? That was just an example. We also have rapid housing prioritization, and then we also work with some of our committees to kind of come up with prioritizations for some of the other resources we've been seeing through COVID, like the emergency housing vouchers and some of those other things that are coming through CHIP. Anybody have any questions about any of that so far? Feel free to type them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself if you would like your voice recorded for posterity. All right, I'm going to keep going, but feel free to jump in with questions at any time. So I mentioned case conferencing. We really try to create space for this. We always want to have as much of this as we can. We really believe that this is a tool that can accelerate outcomes for people. And we really started this a few years ago and started to create more space. I think it's something we're getting better at over time, but we want to let everybody in our system know that this resource is available. I know only some members of your agencies get to attend CHIP, but you can put your clients forward through them, and we're always happy to case conference people. So the reason we started doing this is we were great at doing our kind of intended thing, making referrals, but we wanted to get some more out of meetings. we don't have, as I mentioned, we just don't have the right amount of permanent housing resources to just give everybody what they need to end homelessness. And so we have to get creative. We have to, work together as a system to think about what we want to do and how we can help people get faster and how we can house people without these resources when possible. Because we didn't have enough resources, we were noticing that people with kind of middle to lower scores, they might be on our chronic lists or our families list for like a really long time because they're just not coming up and being prioritized for resources. So we wanted to bring those folks into the discussion, like how do we actually serve them better? How do we, even though we are not going to match them with a resource, what can we do to try to end their homelessness? And finally, how can CHIP just be a strong tool to ending homelessness in Washtenaw County? And another reason is we had so many experts on homelessness around the table. And we used to spend our meetings just kind of hearing about what clients were up to. They're in the shelter, they're outside, they're working on finding housing. That's really great information. We absolutely need it to run this process. But it was a much better use of our time to kind of shift that outside the meeting and get people engaged around problem solving for clients and how do we get that process moving forward. And in a way, it's also a better value because actually having all these staff and case members in these meetings, it's kind of expensive for our system. So we want to get the most value we can out of having all these experts around the table. So what case conferencing looks like, sometimes our staff, when we're making the by name list, we might identify clients or hopefully they're brought up by providers. And we want it to be just as simple as like, if you're feeling stuck with a client, do you need some ideas? Like that can be a great time for case conferencing. We know that you guys are all case conferencing within your agencies too. Obviously, sometimes that's enough. But if you're ever at a point where you're case conferencing within your agency and you're out of ideas, CHIP is a great place to bring the clients. We present the client to the group. We want to find out like where the client's now. Do they have a current housing plan or goal? Like what's the plan there? What are the barriers to housing? What's been tried so far? That's always really helpful to kind of go through. Well, here's the things we've done, and here's where we're stuck. And then finally, like let's think together about what resources might be available to the client. How can we problem solve together? And then we try to have a focused conversation on housing, particularly, although sometimes the barrier is not housing. Sometimes we need to remove a different barrier to get to the housing, obviously. But we try to get to that focused conversation and think together on what can we do as a system, what resources might be out there in the community that are untapped, what landlords might some other case manager know about that our agency doesn't, that sort of a thing. It's not a perfect solution, right? Obviously, sometimes we have a case conferencing that we don't feel like we've moved the ball forward. But most of the time, we shake the tree a little bit and then a few things fall out and hopefully it helps get people move forward. It's just a way of kind of focusing our entire system's attention on the one client for a minute. And it can just really, really be helpful in kind of getting that forward. So we also have a few other CHIP committees that support this work. I kind of wanted to mention some of them. So we have a CHIP prep committee that meets on the alternate Tuesdays. They plan the agenda, we support the CHIP process. Sometimes we follow up on referrals. Occasionally, when there's a really time-sensitive one that can't wait a week, we'll make a referral. That's an open process. Every agency is more than welcome to attend that. If your agency doesn't have somebody attending that meeting and you want to be a part of it, shoot me an email. We'll get you involved. We want this to be a transparent, bottom-up process. CHIP works best when everybody feels like they're part of running it. We really want that to be the case. We also have leadership teams. Amanda Carlisle at WHA runs those. We have one each for veterans, chronic, and family homelessness. They meet monthly to plan strategy, go over our data. They also meet jointly every quarter to kind of look at our system data and think about long-term strategy. And then finally, we have a VI SPDAT subcommittee that meets on occasion. As we mentioned earlier, the VI SPDAT's not always a perfect tool. One of the barriers is sometimes clients are either unwilling or unable to properly represent kind of the things going on with them when they're taking the assessment. And so sometimes our assessments are just, I guess for lack of a better term, obviously like underselling what a client's needs are. And so when it's a case that an assessment is just clearly not accurate, we have this committee that meets We ask the agency to bring the client forward with some examples of what's going on with them and why the score is not reflected, maybe some examples of other CHIP clients. And this is a way where we kind of together maybe decide on what's a more realistic score as a community, kind of with experts and representatives from all the agencies there. So it's a way of kind of rectifying when the score doesn't match. That's a tool that's always available. If your client's kind of lower on the CHIP list, and you're like, what is going on? This person's very high need, but they've got a 3. That's what this committee's for. We haven't seen it used very much during the pandemic. That might be because we've had so many resources coming in, but it also might just be because we have new staff. We don't know that. So please be aware of it. If you're ever interested in using it, talk to your CHIP representative or send me or Lauren an email. We're always happy to facilitate that. Okay, and I believe that is kind of the end of our brief introduction to CHIP, ending right on time at 9:35. Look at that. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to equal access? Okay, give me just a moment to switch my screen. Sorry, I'm getting an email from one of our presenters. Oh, there she is. Okay. Okay, I'm going to switch presentations here. We're going to go into the equal access rule. Okay. All right, so we're going to just talk a little bit about the equal access rule.
Andrew,
That's, huh?
we cannot see the presentation.
Oh,
I
thank
still
you.
see the CHIP, yep.
Thanks for the heads up. The equal access rule, is it working now? Excellent, thank you so much. So the equal access rule is a rule from HUD. For those of you who don't speak, federal bureaucracy, a rule is actually essentially a law when it comes from an agency. A rule is when an agency like HUD takes the laws of Congress and says this is how they'll be applied. And so this is sort of a very mandatory thing that we all have to follow. I don't say that to scare people. It's pretty straightforward. But it is something to pay attention to as we go through our work together as a system trying to end homelessness. When we talk about equal access, we're going to be talking about things like race and gender and sexuality. So I just want to put out there that this can obviously be a very sensitive topic for some people. We want this training to be a safe space for everybody. So please feel free to ask questions. Sometimes this can be confusing topic to think through for some folks, so that's okay. This is a great place to ask questions, but please try your best to be respectful of everybody as you do so. Okay, so why is equal access important? This is just a few examples. There are many more out there. But the equal access rule does specifically focus a lot on gender. And that's in part because for homeless youth up to age 24, the average age of first-time homeless is 15 years old for average LGBTQ youth. A recent study nationally showed that 2/3 of homeless shelters failed to enroll a person properly once they identified as transgender. That's not local, that's a national thing. The same study found that nearly a quarter of homeless transgendered residents report being assaulted by other residents or staff at homeless shelters. So these are important issues for our system to try to wrestle with. For all systems, we want to make sure that everybody experiencing homelessness has a safe opportunity to access shelter and access all our services, because our mission is to end homelessness for everybody. So national data from agencies serving youth show that 40% of people up to age 24 experiencing homelessness are LGBTQ. At drop-in centers, that number is 43%, street outreach, 30%, housing programs, 30%. In Washtenaw County, Less than 1% of our homeless population identifies as transgender, but 12.5% of youth. This varies from year to year, but it can be up to 12.5% of our youth identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. Ozone House reports that 25% of youth seeking assistance for LGBTQ specific situations, but the number is probably higher, right? Because it may not come up for all youth. As a CoC, we don't collect data on sexual orientation, so we only have data on transgender or gender nonconforming. And in fact, the new HUD data standards that are coming out are actually going to have more options for that, so we'll be able to better capture how people self-report their gender. But I do want to say, just in the past couple of months, as I was looking at some of our system data, we've just seen a pretty big spike of people who are transgender or gender nonconforming entering our system. We know the eviction moratorium just ended, and it's very much possibly the case that people who are transgendered are experiencing, more likely to experiencing housing instability as a result of the pandemic. So this isn't just a youth issue, this is across our system. So how does this fit in with our CoC? First of all, already we should be having this client-centered approach. So making sure that our system's available to everybody really just matches with that, because we're trying to let our clients tell us what their needs are, as well as what their resources and abilities to remove those barriers are. It goes well with client choice because our system ideally is going to let clients drive the process. We're there to support and help them reach their goals. Clients, one of the main aspects of this rule is clients get to be placed in programs according to how they present their gender identity. Does everybody understand what I mean by gender identity? That might be different than gender expression, which might be the outward manifestations like clothing and haircut or other ways that we signal gender. But gender identity is just sort of a person's own sense of their gender. It's not something that's visible to other people. And so the only way we know what a client's gender identity is what they tell us. Equal access also goes right along with housing first, because our goal is to house everybody without requirements or added barriers. And so ensuring that our system is accessible to everybody just goes right along with that goal. So the federal equal access requirements, this is the big fancy stuff that we all have to pay attention to. Like I mentioned, it's a HUD equal access to housing rule. And it says that all services coordinated through the continuum of care, that's us, must be available to all eligible persons, regardless of actual or perceived race, color, national origin, religion, sex, age, familial status, disability, actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and marital status. That says a lot. It kind of covers just about every category I think you can think of, maybe a couple more we'll get to. But you know, this is just basically the expression of federal law that says we can't discriminate against people for any reason that they can't change. And these are all factors about people that they can't themselves change. So it's really important that we make sure that everybody coming in, no matter of their situation, has the ability to access our services in the same manner as everybody else. In addition to the HUD ones, which are the federal requirements, because we're in Michigan, there is also a few additional classes. Click through these. Height and weight are also protected classes in the state of Michigan, as well as familial and marital status. I think that was in the other one too. Finally, we have our local CLC policy, which says a little more simply, but just says that all clients need to be informed of their right to access housing and services without discrimination, and of their right to initiate a grievance process if they believe they've been discriminated against. Now, I'm happy to report that we have not gotten a lot of discrimination complaints. So I hope that means that people are doing a great job with this. This is trainings here because we're supposed to do it annually. We want to reinforce the great job you guys are doing. So when we talk about family composition, we want to make sure we're clear on what we mean by that. The rule defines family but not limited to the following: a single person, a group of people who living together. It could be a family with or without children. They could be temporarily in foster care. That could be a family. It could be an elderly family, a near elderly family, a disabled family. I don't know. These are lots of examples of families. The remaining member of a 10-member family. These are all considered families. Everybody's got to be served. For example, you could have a non-romantic group of people, maybe two people who want to be roommates, who want to be served together as a family. We can serve them together as a family. Doesn't matter what their gender identity is. If they're seeking services together as a family, that's how we do it. But just in short, you can't deny people recognition as a family or services according to the Equal Access Rule. Now, who does this apply to? This definitely applies to all HUD and MSHDA funded programs, which includes continuum of care funding and ESG funding. So just for example of some agencies, all of these are here. Avalon, IHN, MAP, Ozone House, Safe House, Salvation Army, the Shelter Association, SOS. We can add legal services in there now. I don't know if your agency is not here, but if they're not here, we might be funding you now. So you might be under this. If for some reason your program you believe doesn't fall under this, please follow it anyway, because it's still federal and state law. Just to wrap up, we're going to go into just a few best practices around this. To start, promote the dignity, respect, and value of every individual. This is just so essential from an equity standpoint. People have it rough when they're seeking our services, right? I mean, someone entering shelter could literally be having the worst day of their life. And to the extent that we can, making that a process where they're respected and valued and are able to preserve their dignity as much as possible can go a tremendous way to minimizing the trauma of homelessness. So we want to respect client choice. So this means individuals get to be placed in accordance with their gender identity. So for instance, at our individual shelter, I know we have like men's floors and women's floors. If someone presents, and even if they outwardly look male, but tell you that they're female, then we have to believe them and listen that they're female and place them according to what they're telling us their gender identity is. I use that example because a beard's a pretty common outward expression of gender, example of gender expression for men. But that's, that's just one example. People need to be placed in accordance with what they tell us their gender is. And remember, gender identity is not something that's visible. We can only take their word for it. We need to respect the client's assessment of what feels safe within the program or outside referrals. So that means that, clients always have choice when it comes to what services and where they're placed. If a client decides that, for example, that they look at the women's floor where they wanted to be placed and decides it might be safer for them to be on the men's floor instead, then we need to respect that choice. We want to always accept the name, gender, and pronouns given by a client. That's really, really important to the maximum of our ability that we respect who they tell us they are. And we don't want to ask, and it's not relevant to services, so we don't need to ask what a client's sex at birth was. We want to only focus on what they tell us their gender identity is now. Finally, this is so important. Just listen to clients. This isn't about us telling them to prove their gender. This is what they're telling us. They're in a vulnerable position already, coming and asking for help, which takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability and courage. And so this is all about remaining, those low barriers, keeping it easy for them, making it simple for them to access services. We can't ask people to prove their gender. So I've been talking a lot about shelter. This does apply to a lot of services, but where a lot of these issues tend to come up is in shelter. So how do we focus an inclusive shelter community? So we want to resolve conflicts quickly. So sometimes, I'm not really talking about staff as much here, but if clients themselves have conflicts, we want to resolve this quickly. We know from that data we showed that a lot of clients do experience harassment if they're transgender. And so we want to also make sure that when there are conflicts, if someone needs to be expelled, we're focusing on the aggressor, not on the victim. Part of this also is making sure that there's always a space and the availability for clients to express concerns that's confidential, so that if they do have a concern about how something's going, they have the ability to tell you in a safe way so that we can respond appropriately. We have to ensure the confidentiality of the client, even within your own organization. Someone's transgender status or sexual orientation, things like that, often aren't explicitly relevant to someone's housing plans. They just don't need to be brought up. In the CHIP space, for example, we need to know what someone's pronouns are so we can refer to them correctly. But that's about as far as it needs to go. Otherwise, we need to keep the conversations around the housing. Like I was mentioning just then, if someone's going through a gender transition or their gender history, it's not something that really needs to be shared with other staff. If the client feels like that's something relevant, the client can bring that up. If there is something that's going on, I want to make sure that we invite the clients into a private, safe space where we're not breaching confidentiality. If there are violations of any of this stuff, if you think something like discrimination is going on, we are here for that. That's part of our role as the CoC. But please feel free to start in-house and ask questions of your supervisor and ask what's going on. Finally, we just want to remind everybody, of some things that people might be asking. We're really used to the spaces we work in, so we might not always ask these questions, but this is what someone's going to be thinking about when they're coming in for shelter or coming in for services. They're going to be wondering, can they be themselves here, or they're going to have to hide who they are? Is this going to be somewhere where they might experience violence? This is especially true for people who've been living on the streets a while. Will people who work here actually understand what I need? Am I safe here? So, these are real profound kind of hard questions to answer. And these are things that people do ask themselves when they come in. And that's all we're talking about in making a safe space. How do we make this as welcoming and comfortable and dignified an environment as possible for people who need our services? So as I mentioned earlier, if there's a conflict between two individuals over everybody, don't focus on the cooperative harassed person, focus on the aggressor. You should always in your staff training incorporate multiple ways to address and resolve impermissible conflict. We know this stuff occurs, so be prepared. Work on that in your training. And always make sure that your conflict resolution does not involve expulsion of the victims of harassment. And that is kind of the end of everything I have. Does anybody have any questions? I know that's sort of a lot and a heavy subject for a Friday morning, but hopefully it's clear. We just want our services to be available to everybody who needs them, and we need your help to do it. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. That's all right. We're just a couple minutes ahead of schedule, which is just fine. So we'll go ahead and move on to our break. I believe we're set to break until, we'll say until 10:05. So folks can get up, stretch, encourage you to move about a bit, get some coffee, that sort of thing.
Hey Andrew, it's Callie.
Hey, Callie.
Morning.
Glad you found the link. Sorry for the confusion.
You know what? Today was a rough day. I went the wrong way, not the wrong way on the highway, but I went in the wrong direction than I meant to on the highway this morning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that sounds worse than it was. So anyway, it's been a rough morning. I'm sorry, but I see I'm a co-host and Tish is a co-host, so I'll just plan on sharing the PowerPoint. It shouldn't be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think when you start sharing, it'll just disrupt my sharing, or I can stop sharing and then you can start.
Yeah, That's fine. I mean, I heard you say people are coming back at 5 after, right? So I'll just plan on.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah, you can just start then. It is being recorded, so I know lawyers are fond of caveats, so please put whatever ones you need in about.
Oh, you know
the
us
date.
so well, Andrew. Yes, there is a caveat. There's
I
already a
totally
caveat.
know. That's why I wanted to make sure it's fresh in your head.
Yep. There is one, there is a slide of a caveat. So
Oh, perfect.
yeah.
Yeah, I just know there's always this information's only good today.
Yeah, it's true. That's exactly what we do when it's being recorded. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to stretch too. That sounds like a great idea. And I'll come
Yeah,
back
me
in
too.
a few
Awesome.
minutes.
But glad you're here.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrew, I was looking for the link myself. I was like, where's the link at?
I am so sorry. I guess the calendar invite got. I just sent the one that Zoom gave me. I don't know. So I'm gonna say it's Zoom's fault.
So you can disregard my message.
I haven't even gotten to it yet.
Okay. Hey folks, I'm Callie. I can't tell because everybody's cameras are off if they're back, but I'm gonna just assume they are, and you're probably not gonna miss too much important information if you come back a few minutes late. I'm Callie Dendrinos. I'm a staff attorney at Legal Services of South Central Michigan. I'm in our Washtenaw County office, and my managing attorney Tish Lee is here as well. And we were gonna present a little bit on just some basic housing law stuff that might be useful to you. And I recognize that there is a very mixed group here of people who are brand new to the work, people who've been doing this work for a very long time, some people who have actually seen me present before. So I apologize in advance if this is like not new information to you. But I think it's sometimes useful to be reminded of the basics. So I'm doing sort of a mixed potpourri grab bag of renters' rights topics. And then Tish is going to talk a little bit more about leases, lease renewals, changing lease terms, things that you may see in your work. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to have the chance to talk to y'all. I really enjoy working with caseworkers. I think it's really gratifying work. So I'm happy to be here. And I will stop talking. Well, I will keep talking, but I will actually start talking about the actual presentation. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'm not going to be able to see anything once I start this PowerPoint. So could somebody verbally just, there's my thumbs up. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so some renters' rights in Washtenaw County specifically, because as we'll see, some of these protections are specific to the cities that people live in. It's not everything. We could talk a really long time about this topic, but we won't. And it's not important for you to remember it all. It's, I think, more important just to remind you of these things so that there's like a little niggling in the back of your head if a client comes in and starts talking about an issue. You don't have to know the answer, just that it might be an issue. Here's the standard caveat, the disclaimer that Andrew totally called. You know, we're doing this presentation, it's being recorded. It's today, September 17th. So some stuff might change, you know, laws change, just a heads up about that. I wanted to start, here's the agenda. I wanted to start by just saying, like, where the heck do these things come from? You know, because you'll see that will matter as we start talking about the specific rights involved. And then I'll talk briefly about the right to repairs, the right to privacy, and then also basically the right to not be discriminated against, the protections against discrimination in housing. And also, I'm very casual, obviously. If you feel the need to interrupt, if it's not an interruption, if you have a question, please do, please ask, no problem there. So let's start with, where do these tenants' rights come from? So the law gives tenants rights. People can get them through lots of different methods. Sometimes they come from decisions that judges have made in specific cases, in lawsuits, where lawyers like me raise certain arguments and the judges agree or they don't agree. That might be the source of a right. So now we know that, you know, the Michigan Supreme Court said X, Y, Z in this case, so therefore tenants should have that protection. There's also laws that are passed by different legislatures that can be the source of tenant protections. So that includes laws passed by Congress, like the Fair Housing Act, which we're going to talk about. That can include laws passed by state legislatures, and we'll see a couple of those. And that can also include laws made by local governments, and we will also see some of those. So it's sort of a, I don't know how to describe it. There's lots of sources for these rights, and I think that can make it confusing for folks sometimes to keep straight, like, well, wait, where was that law? Where did that come from? It just is what it is. But I think it helps explain why in some places certain protections exist and why in other locations they might not. So first we'll start with an easy one, I think, pretty straightforward, the right to repairs, because landlords are required to make repairs. And maybe you know that, but a lot of landlords, don't necessarily. So they need to keep the unit, sometimes the phrase is called fit and habitable, but they need to keep the unit up. If a tenant causes a damage, the landlord could say that it's their responsibility to pay for it. But generally speaking, it's a landlord's job to keep the place up. That's one of the benefits of being a tenant. I wanted to briefly mention, what should a tenant do if a landlord won't make repairs? Because I know you will hear about that. My number one piece of advice is to have the tenant put it in writing. So many of my clients do things verbally. And I understand that. I think especially at the beginning of a landlord-tenant relationship, you want to keep things casual, but documentation is important. And a lot of the rights that tenants have in this area require written notice so that the landlord can't say they didn't know. So that's the first point. And then there are options. And again, these are not things I expect you to tell clients, to advise them on. I just want you to be aware that tenants do have some remedies available to them if landlords don't make repairs. They can sometimes escrow their rent, which means withhold it, ideally in an account, but at least hold on to it and not spend it, because sometimes our clients do, and that's a real bummer. The idea is they withhold the rent until the landlord makes the repairs. They can sometimes make the repairs themselves and then deduct that from the rent. Again, very important to keep documentation of all of this. They can call the building inspectors. The cities and the townships in this area do have building inspectors who can come out and inspect a unit. And if the unit isn't up to code, they can give a notice to the landlord telling them to fix it. This is also true for folks on Section 8. There are inspectors employed by the Section 8 programs. And by Section 8, I mean the Housing Choice Voucher Program. You might hear it also called the Voucher Program. That might be Ann Arbor Housing Commission or MISHDA. And in this area, MISHDA has two companies it works with, RPI and CMA. So if you have clients talking about those agencies, they probably have a Section 8 voucher and they can probably ask for an inspection. The power of Section 8's inspections is that if a landlord doesn't make the repairs that Section 8 says they need to make, Section 8 can start withholding the rent, its portion of the rent, not the tenant's portion. The tenant cannot be evicted for that. And eventually the tenant can terminate the lease, which is, a choice that the tenant would need to make if they want to pursue this route. But it can be powerful because otherwise tenants can't terminate their leases in the middle of the year with Section 8. That was a lot. I'm gonna pause while we go on to the next slide to see if anybody has questions. Okay. Michigan Legal Help is, I think, just a gem. It's a really unique website for the comprehensive amount of information that's on it. So I'm showing you the homepage. It's a really good place to start with just basic issues. And it's not just housing law that they talk about. It's specific to Michigan. It's created by Michigan lawyers who are actually in a sister organization to mine. They update it regularly. You'll see there's information about coronavirus on here. So it's a really good place to go just for legal help generally. So I'm plugging it. You can search for the issue. I've made the orange arrow to tell you to point you to the search bar, and also the green arrow to show you that the housing section and some of the topics that it covers. The link that I sent, you may not be able to, it may not hyperlink. I know it's tough with these presentations. You don't need to be able to, but if you search Michigan Legal Help for repairs, you'll be able to find it. It's a toolkit that actually helps tenants put together that letter that I mentioned, the written notice that's required to tell the landlord what the issue is and ask them to fix it. So that's really cool. You don't need a lawyer to do that. So, okay, stopping briefly again before we move on to the second issue, which is right to privacy. Any questions on repairs? Okay. Right to privacy is a little bit more of a nebulous, I think, topic. The idea is, and this is old common law, which means, judges have been saying this probably since Great Britain in the 1400s, that tenants should have the right to, we call it quiet enjoyment, but they have the right to enjoy their place undisturbed. It's not the place where a landlord should be coming in and out every day, or anybody for that matter, besides the tenant and the people the tenant chooses. So practically speaking, what that means is landlords shouldn't be harassing tenants. They shouldn't be entering the home, every day. They shouldn't be entering the home without notice. They shouldn't be entering the home without permission, and they shouldn't be doing it a lot. So there are landlords in this area who sometimes do that. Not a lot. I think most landlords know this, but it's important to realize it because it does come up with our clients. And it's also important to realize it because the cities of Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor both have adopted more specific laws, giving tenants even more protections actually in this area, more concrete stuff, which I think is useful to know about. So the city of Ypsilanti, which I think has a more protective law, says that landlords actually have to give tenants 72 hours notice in writing before they enter a unit. And there's a shorter timeline if they're trying to sell the home or if it's the very end of the lease, which makes sense because now we're talking about landlords trying to relet the unit or to sell it. They need to show it to people. But generally speaking, 72 hours notice with the name of the person coming, and the tenant can expect to ask for identification too. I don't think this happens. I don't, but I think it's important that tenants realize they have this right because there are those few landlords who do, I think, sometimes abuse this. And they basically treat the property as theirs. And that's what they'll say, well, I own this place. But that's not what the law says about the landlord-tenant relationship. You know, tenants are supposed to have the right of undisturbed use. There are remedies available in this area as well. Something that I think is worth mentioning to this group is that eventually a tenant can terminate a lease in the city of Ypsilanti for this issue. So if a tenant is complaining about that, just something to know. You don't have to remember it. It's more about helping you issue spot when these issues come up. And then you can, call us or check Michigan Legal Help to help find the answer for what the tenant can do. The city of Ann Arbor's right to privacy, right of entry law, they call it, is different. It just says landlords are going to make a good faith effort to give prior notice. That's very vague. What does that mean? Who knows? They have to knock and announce themselves. They can't just walk in. And if the tenant says no, they can't come in. But actually what's interesting in Ann Arbor is actually a tenant can initiate extra protections by putting in writing their request that a landlord not do that and that a landlord start giving them written notice and only enter for very specific things like emergencies or to make repairs. If they invoke that right, then the landlord has to give written notice and the tenant can even delay that. So again, not expecting you to remember these nuances, but just wanting you to know that there are some ways to control this and there are some remedies available if landlords aren't following these rules. So that's the right to privacy. This is the part I'm really excited to talk to you about. I will stop though and see if anybody has questions. Okay, cool. Let's talk about discrimination. So this third area, like I said, this is a total potpourri of topics. I know they're not really connected by anything in particular. This is probably the juiciest one. It's the protection against discrimination in housing. And I like to start, again, apologies. I know some of you have probably already seen this presentation, this part of it. But I like to start with the historical context because I think it explains why we have things like anti-discrimination laws, specifically in housing. And the context is that there were lots of ways that Americans and the American government segregated folks and perpetuated segregation in housing. We're looking at redlining maps, which is one of the methods that the US government used. And the source of this is from a website called Mapping Inequality, which is a really cool, kind of devastating website that tells us, that shows us these maps that were created in the early to mid 1900s to help the federal government decide, as it started with the New Deal, as it started supporting more home ownership among Americans, the government was deciding whether to insure mortgages. There were a few different agencies involved in that. And as part of their calculation, they were asking about risk. And as part of their decisions about risk, whether or not this was a risky mortgage or not, they actually looked at things like racial composition, religious composition, immigration status of neighborhoods. So redlined neighborhoods, as we call them, are the ones in these maps, the red areas. Those were the ones that were considered highest risk. And you can still read the descriptions on this website and in other places too of why they were considered too high risk. But the racism is like very explicit. They're very clear about not wanting people of color, immigrants, Jews, like the descriptions are, like I said, kind of horrifying. On the left is the city of Kalamazoo. Middle is Jackson. On the right is Detroit. There are other cities in Michigan that had these maps. I can't remember. I think green is the best. And those were the ones most likely to get mortgage insurance. But the consequence was that lots of folks in these other neighborhoods weren't getting insurance, which meant they couldn't buy homes, which meant, cycles of segregation, of inequality, of inability to collect wealth, those were perpetuated. I know that was a lot, but I want to start there because that's why we have the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in the 60s after the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It was one of the things he was pushing for, and it prohibits discrimination in housing. And that includes in leasing housing. So it's very broadly defined and includes a lot of other areas too, but for our conversation today, it means landlords shouldn't be discriminating against tenants based on certain things. And there are only certain groups that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So like people named Callie are not a protected group, but there's sort of the standard 7 categories of groups that are protected, and those I've listed here. It's important to realize this because you may come across landlords who are honestly still engaging in this, either openly or more insidiously. And it's also important to realize this because local governments have adopted even more protections, which we're going to talk about briefly. And we definitely see tenants being denied for those reasons too. And so I want to make sure that the group knows. There's some exceptions to this law. You know, it doesn't apply to every single landlord, every single tenant, but generally speaking in this county, it does. I want to speak specifically about disability because that also comes up for our clients a lot. Folks with disabilities are not supposed to be discriminated against. They're protected by the Federal Fair Housing Act. And a branch of that law that's been developed again through cases from judges is something called a reasonable accommodation. So this means that landlords are supposed to accommodate people with disabilities so that they can fully enjoy the use of their unit, so that they're not being disadvantaged solely because they're disabled. So the classic example is if somebody needs a parking spot assigned and the landlord doesn't usually do that, somebody who can show a connection between a disability and the need for the parking spot should be able to ask for that. It's reasonable, right? They're not asking for valet parking. They're asking for an assigned parking spot. There are limits to this, of course. I've listed them here. You don't have to worry about that, but it's just something to know. And it comes up a lot actually for our clients. So you might see it in the form of emotional support animals where a landlord is saying no pets and a tenant is saying, I need this animal. That's really important for my PTSD, for example, my anxiety, my depression. Sometimes those can be reasonable accommodations that landlords need to permit under the Fair Housing Act. Assigned parking lot, parking spot, we've talked about. Extra bedrooms for live-in aides, that comes up. And then this one I just mentioned because we see it fairly frequently actually. If my only source of income is, let's say, SSI because I'm disabled and I don't get paid until the 3rd of the month, then my rent is always going to be late. And we have in the past asked and received an agreement from landlords that tenants be permitted to pay late with no late fee because it's not their fault. They're disabled. They literally can't work. That's the definition of SSI, one of the tests for SSI. And why are they being penalized for that? I'm going to stop there for a second again. I know that was a lot of information. I'm really trying to be speedy because I think you're going to want to hear more from Tish and have a lot of questions for Tish, but I'll stop right there. Any questions on reasonable accommodations? Okay. Is this making sense? Can I get some like nods or, yeah, okay, cool. So state protections, remember we were talking about there's multiple sources of tenant protections and that we were just talking about a federal law, the Federal Fair Housing Act, that helps protect tenants against discrimination. There are also a couple state level laws that protect tenants against discrimination. And they cover the same groups that the federal law protects, those 7 groups that we've talked about, but they add 2 on. They add age and marital status. There are still exceptions. Again, certain landlords aren't going to be covered, but generally speaking, tenants shouldn't be getting discriminated against in the state of Michigan because they're too old or too young, because they're single or because they're married or because they're divorced. I don't know, maybe people have prejudice against people who are divorced, who knows? But that's good to know about. And then in the next category, there's local protections. In this county, there are local protections against discrimination that are much broader because municipalities, cities, can adopt local laws on this topic. And so in this city, in this county, there's Ypsi and Ann Arbor have both adopted very comprehensive anti-discrimination ordinances, which just means laws prohibiting discrimination for specific groups. You'll see the first 7 standard protected groups at the top of this list. And then the red are the new ones. So this is a lot of stuff. I highlighted the two that I think are I don't know if I should say the most important, but I think are maybe the ones I see denied for a lot. Criminal records in the city of Ypsi are generally not supposed to be a reason to deny somebody. So what I'm saying is your clients should not be getting denied just because they have a criminal record. And they shouldn't be getting terminated if a landlord rescreens them because of a criminal record. I wrote some criminal records because there is some squishy language in their ordinance about whether or not a specific crime is a problem. Basically, whether or not it's going to be a threat to the other tenants. But I would argue anything from a long time ago is not a threat, and a lot of types of crimes are not threats. So that's a good thing to know about in the city of Ypsilanti. Also, source of income, which is sort of a vague phrase that means Section 8, or any other discrimination based on what type of income a tenant has. So we saw a case recently where a local landlord was saying unemployment income was not adequate. He wanted to see employment income. But this unit was within the city of Ypsilanti, and so that tenant is protected by this ordinance. I'm going to give a brief moment to process that. The city of Ann Arbor also has protections, and these are even longer. I mean, there is a lot of stuff on this list. Basically, nobody should be getting discriminated against in housing in Ann Arbor. I want to again draw your attention though to the source of income protection. So if you hear a landlord saying, I don't take Section 8 in the city of Ann Arbor, that is a problem. That is discrimination. And we'll talk about what to do about it if you see it, but just planting that seed in your head. And also criminal records are comprehensively not permitted to be the basis of a denial. So you should not be seeing tenants, your clients, denied for housing because of their criminal records. That's like a brand new law that got adopted within the last year. Really important to know because it's definitely still happening. I think there's not a lot of awareness. And so one of my goals in this presentation was to make sure that folks who are working with a lot of tenants, like the CoC, can pass that information on. If you think that's happening, you don't have to figure it out. You don't have to be like, what was the slide that said there are exceptions for certain landlords? You don't have to do that. You just need to know about us, my organization, Legal Services, and also the Fair Housing Center. We are so lucky that we have an organization located in Ann Arbor, or in the county at least. I actually don't know where their office is, but they're in Washtenaw County. And their work is focused on stopping discrimination. And they will work on local discrimination ordinances as well as the federal and state level ones. So
Kelly, we have some questions in the chat. Do you want to take a pause?
I would love
Yeah.
I would love to. That was the end of the presentation anyway. Let's talk.
Perfect timing. Great. So it looks like the first, I had responded to Ellen's question about accommodations applying to HUD properties. I think that was your question, Ellen. If I didn't answer it or I didn't understand your question, let me know. But yes, HUD subsidized properties must comply with all anti-discrimination laws, state and federal.
What about Section 8? They would allow for an extra bedroom? You know,
Yeah.
if a family is a family of two, but they need a caretaker,
yeah,
they can get a 3-bedroom place.
They can request that. And actually the HUD subsidized properties are subject to an even stricter standard.
Okay.
I mean, they are subject to the Fair Housing Act, absolutely, and should not be discriminating on the basis of disability. If anybody's not discriminating, God, I hope it's the HUD subsidized buildings, right? But also they are also required to sometimes pay for modifications to the unit for physical disabilities. So yes.
Thank you.
Let's see, David, is there a list of specific crimes that do not fall under protected groups? So let's clarify again where we're at. We're in the non-discrimination world. We're talking about local ordinances that only apply in the city that the local government covers. So in the city of Ann Arbor, what happened is the law says criminal records alone should not be the basis for a denial. So there is no specific list of crimes. The other local ordinance that exists around here is the city of Ypsilanti. And the city of Ypsilanti's language is fuzzier. So for a tenant who's applying to a place in Ypsi and is denied, Ypsi's ordinance says they shouldn't be denied unless the crime is a threat to other tenants or the landlord. The language is basically that squishy. That's not precisely the language, but there is no list of crimes, which is very frustrating to me. There is a process to challenge a denial. So you can sue under the city of Ypsilanti's ordinance. You can also file a complaint with the city. And if that's information people need, always happy to share it. Fair Housing Center will also have that information. But it's important to just to know that you can challenge that if a tenant wants to pursue it. And then I see Jesse texted to say, a family who's been denied doesn't want to go through the legal process. Should we bring it to us? Not to me, but because we need clients. We're a law firm. Legal Services is a law firm, and we need clients usually to handle cases. But the Fair Housing Center, actually, it's really cool that they can do this. They have testers. So if an issue is reported to them, and it could be reported by you or the tenant or anybody, a landlord's employee even, they can actually send folks out to test for the issue. So they'll have folks who are either in the situation or act like they're in the situation that's at issue, pretend they have a misdemeanor conviction, for example, and try. And if the landlord says, no, we don't take people with criminal records, now the Fair Housing Center can start working on that, on addressing that. And they have lawyers they work with. They contact landlords directly themselves. So they have a lot of options. I understand why tenants don't want to go through that process. I think it's totally reasonable. I think it's probably likely that they'll actually say that. So it's important to know that, no, you do not need the client to report this issue to the Fair Housing Center. Okay, Ellen.
I just wanted to throw in there, Callie, as an
Yes.
aside about misdemeanors and criminal records. Do folks know about the new expungement law? Anybody know about it? Oh, some people know.
One thumbs up.
Yeah. So this is actually a pretty huge change in Michigan, and it's recent, and you can find out a lot of information about it on Michigan Legal Help. So I won't go into it, but yeah, if someone has a single misdemeanor and it's old and it's not, it's a certain kind of misdemeanor, the laws are pretty complicated, but you may want to encourage your client to look into whether or not it can be expunged.
And it's not just misdemeanors, actually. There are
Mhm.
felonies that can be covered too, depending. So
Right.
Michigan Legal Help is a good place to go for that. I'm just checking online now. It's on the homepage. There is under the crime, traffic, and ID section, there's a link to expungement, but you can just search it as well. There was another question, Ellen's. Where was that? Lack of social security card, especially for undocumented. Also criminal sexual offense. How does that stand out? Okay, let's take those by turn. I'm not sure what you're asking me. So tell me what you're asking me, Ellen.
Okay, so if someone is undocumented and it says in the city of you just had on your slide that the city of Ann Arbor says they can't discriminate against undocumented people, but undocumented people don't have social security cards. So if they don't have a social security card, can they use that as a way to refuse housing for somebody?
So these are like the really interesting questions that I, as a lawyer, I think are kind of exciting. Is like, ooh, like how are they going to try to evade it? And how will you show that they're doing it to evade the purposes of the law? That's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I think it's very possible, like source of income. If I say you can't take Section 8, then a landlord may decide that their response will be, well, fine, but I'm going to require an 800 or 750 credit score and screen people out that way,
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the law doesn't and can't anticipate every factual variation and then write it out. I mean, the law would be never ending if we did it that way. So there's always going to be gray areas, but I think that's an interesting question. And I think it might be worth talking to Fair Housing Center because I do think I think that's an interesting question. Insisting on a social security number is pretty standard. Leases always ask for that, the rental
Mhm.
applications. And if somebody doesn't have one, what happens? I don't know. I think, in the city of Ann Arbor,
Yeah, I
can
could
get an
see it even
ID.
be a bigger issue for subsidized housing, because I know that there's some subsidized housing rules that require people to provide.
Right.
So,
Right.
And the federal, okay, now we're getting into some stickier legal stuff. So HUD has its own rules. HUD is a federal agency, right?
Mhm.
HUD subsidizes Section 8 and public housing. A lot of the subsidized programs we see, the affordable housing we see, is subsidized by HUD. If the federal government says you need to be a citizen or need to be a legal permanent resident, for example, to apply for this housing, then that's going to apply. The city of Ann Arbor can't say up to the government, to the federal government, nah, you're wrong, not in this city, man. They can say that for units that are not subsidized by HUD, but HUD dictates what happens in HUD funded properties to a large extent. And there are rules in the different programs about immigration status, which are, I don't remember. I honestly don't remember offhand, because some, you know, we don't need to get into that, but just to say that is possible. So it's more confusing because the city of Ann Arbor can't actually tell HUD what to do. And I'm sorry to say, because I know that makes this, it just makes this all more confusing, doesn't it? So again, you don't have to know the answers, but it's something that it's just worth flagging. If a tenant is being denied for something, you don't have to figure it out on your own. There are agencies in town to help you, but these are really great questions that I think are important to ask. What else? There was this social, okay, also there was, oh gosh, okay guys, here we go. Here we go. Also criminal sexual offense. I think, Ellen, are you talking about the sex offender registry requirement?
Yeah, yes. So how far, you know, that's the one population that seems to always be discriminated against. And
Yes,
so I know
it's a
that
huge
there's
issue.
rules now. So where are we at with that?
Well, so that's one of
crime?
the categories of crimes that HUD allows HUD subsidized housing providers to deny people for. HUD does not care about people with lifetime offender registry requirements. It actually specifically prohibits them from being admitted into, I think, every type of HUD subsidized housing. So that's the HUD world.
Yeah.
On the city side, though, it's more interesting. Again, if we're talking about a not subsidized property, just your normal private landlord-tenant relationship, I read the Ann Arbor ordinance to say it says criminal records. It's not a basis.
Okay.
When that gets tested, because I'm sure it will at some point, I don't know how it will change or if it will change.
Okay.
And there may be other requirements like restrictions that come from the registration requirement itself about where somebody can live,
Yeah.
which I honestly confess I do not know offhand. Is there the 500 feet or is it 500 yards? What's the measurement?
Yeah, there is some, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but yes, there are some indicators, you know, you can't live across the street from a school, or you
Right,
can't,
child
yeah,
care provider.
there's all kinds of, yeah.
So that may in and of itself keep people out of like much of Ann Arbor. Who know? I don't know offhand, but that's still out there, even though in the city there's that protection. All right, what else? Some information from Ronson about the expungement law. I don't think that's true. I think that up to one misdemeanor and one felony can be expunged. I think that's the limit is now higher under the new law. I don't know offhand. I'll find the link when while Tish is talking, and I'll put it in the chat so folks can check out the toolkit, okay? And then there was one more. Social security number for background check. Totally. I don't know what happens in this case. Let's test it out, because that's a great question. If we're in the city of Ann Arbor, maybe landlords shouldn't be doing that, or they should be accepting alternative methods. Voucher be considered a source of income? Yes. So let's back up again, because I know this is complicated. We've got the federal overlay. The federal fair housing law only protects those 7 groups of people: race, gender, national origin, familial status, that stuff. Then we move down to the state level, it adds on a couple more. Then we move down to the local level, and that's where the source of income protections are. In the city of Ypsi, city of Ann Arbor, there's 2 towns in the area that say landlords must accept vouchers. And the laws are actually very clear that vouchers are included as a source of income. So there's no wiggle room there. Landlords can no longer pretend that they don't understand what source of income means. Or maybe they don't. I mean, it's not a very clear phrase. It's a broader phrase that includes people who receive vouchers. So in the city of Ann Arbor and in the city of Ypsilanti, within the city limits, which it's a smaller city, landlords should not be saying they do not take Section 8. And if they are saying that, then that's a call to the Fair Housing Center. Because it's happening. I mean, people do not know. I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's complicated and it's a lot of information, and perhaps it was too much to try to present in a half an hour, but I don't expect you to keep track of it and to know the answers. I don't want you to feel like you have to internalize any of that. It's just to have that suspicion, that question in your brain is like all you need to refer somebody. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks. I really appreciate you and your attention. I'll let Tish talk. I'll find that link.
Thanks, Callie. I think you're totally wrong. I think your topic is much more interesting than my topic. As evidenced by all the questions that people have. And it's a great and also cutting edge issue, because these source of income and criminal record protections are pretty new, and that's why Kelly's saying we have to test a lot of these unique situations. We don't know how far this can be pushed, but it's a step in the right direction, and yeah, and we're excited about it. Thank you. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, is that working? Okay, great, excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to talk in a really sort of basic level about leases and landlord-tenant law in Michigan. And like Callie, it's probably going to be a lot of information. You don't have to absorb all of it. Mostly it's important to know what the resources are and where to look, and to have that, like Kelly said, in the back of your mind, if something doesn't seem right to you, check it out with someone who might know a little bit more. Or again, a plug for Michigan Legal Help. It's a great website. There's a lot of great basic information in there. And if you have any questions, that might be the first place where you want to look, because Michigan Legal Help will also direct you to particular resources in Washtenaw County. If you need them, there's a place where you can enter what county you're in, and it'll be sort of localized, the options that they offer you. But anyway, let me see. Okay, disclaimer again, because we are lawyers after all. I just want to emphasize that this is just general information. You shouldn't use this information to make a decision about the legality of lease provision or something like that, or what a tenant's rights are, because everyone has completely different situations. And I just want you guys to know that we are disclaiming there's this caution. We just want to give you a little overview of lease law and landlord-tenant law in general. So this is what I'm going to talk about. If any of you, I had no idea what people really wanted to hear about. If there's anything that you want to know about that's not on this list, feel free to ask during the question period, or even just let me know right now, because this is just the things that came to my mind when I'm thinking about leases in general. What is a lease? The Truth in Renting Act, security deposits, late fees, early termination of leases. Those seem to be the questions that come up a lot. So what is a lease? So it's an agreement or a contract. So it's a legal relationship, right? And it is a landlord-tenant relationship where the tenant has exclusive possession of premises. It can be oral or written. Most of the ones that we see are written, and that's actually what I'm going to focus on now. There are a lot of requirements for an oral lease, and it's generally, as lawyers, like Kelly was saying, we like to have everything in writing. So it's never really a good idea to try to do an oral lease, because it's so much harder to prove it in court. But we are dealing with written leases mostly. So written leases, usually they're form leases. They're drafted by the landlord or a landlords group like the National Apartment Association, the Michigan Association of Realtors, or whoever they are. And of course, they're drafted from the landlord's point of view and to protect the landlord's rights. And we know from our work on behalf of tenants that tenants don't have a whole lot of bargaining power. They want to rent a place, housing is scarce, and so they sign anything. So part of the problem then that you encounter is that the court usually presumes that if the two parties have signed a written lease, that they've reviewed it, they understand it, and those terms are controlling of the relationship. And it's very hard to say, oh, I didn't understand that, or I didn't think that applied to me. The written terms of the lease are usually going to control that relationship. But we do have some protections in Michigan law, which include the Truth in Renting Act. That's like the big one, because it was the legislature's recognition that there is this unequal bargaining power, and we need to have some protection in place that bars certain kinds of lease provisions and also requires provisions that give tenants notice. So here's like a partial list of some of the things that the Truth in Renting Act bars. And it's by no means an exhaustive list. I think if you're really, really interested in what the text of the act says, you can go to the site that I had earlier, the 554631. But you can like consult a legal advocate or Michigan Legal Help, or if you have you or someone you're helping has a question about it, you can contact legal services if you think they're eligible. If they're eligible and it's just not in litigation, but it's a new case, they'll probably be routed to our hotline, but they can usually answer a lot of these questions either through our hotline or Michigan Legal Help. But a lot of these, I won't read through all of them, but a lot of these prohibited provisions have to do with people's procedural rights, upholding the law that creates obligations for landlords, for landlords to keep places in good repair, to not discriminate, to be liable if they're negligent. This last one on here, the inability to accelerate rent, we'll talk about that a little bit later also when we talk about terminating leases early. The required provisions from the Truth in Renting Act are, first of all, that there has to be a name and address for contacting the landlord if you need to give them notice about certain things. And then you guys have probably seen this notice about the Truth in Renting Act on a lot of leases. The thing about this one is, it doesn't have the cite to the statute. It just talks about the Truth in Renting Act. And so I'm guessing a lot of tenants will see this and they'll say, well, what's the Truth in Renting Act? I have no idea, and I can't afford a lawyer, so I'm never going to find out about these things. Hopefully Michigan Legal Help, the website, can help. If you can't find your answer there, by all means, if the client can afford it, they can go to a private lawyer, or they can go through our hotline and try to get some of these questions answered. But I think that there's so much variation in these individually drafted leases that it's hard to know, it's hard to make that call. But if something doesn't seem right, and I think that Callie alluded to this, if it doesn't smell right, you just have to look a little deeper. And if you think you need some legal advice on it, yeah, definitely look into that further. Okay, I don't know, should I stop and see if anyone has questions about the Truth in Renting Act, or do you guys want me to blow through this and leave the questions to the end? I'm just going to blow through it and leave the questions to the end because I want to keep us on schedule here. Let's see. Security deposits. Okay, so there's also a whole law on security deposits in Michigan, and I've got the site up there, 554.601. One of the big things that we get asked often is how much is a landlord allowed to charge? So the law says not more than 1.5 times monthly rent. Sometimes you'll see someone say, they'll characterize the initial payment to a landlord as first and last month's rent. And that's not really an accurate kind of description. Basically, if you enter into a lease and the landlord says, I want first and last month's rent, essentially probably what they're saying is you're paying for the first month and the other month is your deposit. Some landlords will let you, like if you are at the end of your lease, you're at the last month of your lease and you're intending on leaving, they'll say, okay, I'll just use what you paid at the very beginning for the last month's rent. But most landlords want to hold on to that until after you leave to make sure that there are no damages that they can charge against you. The security deposit law also has required language that must be put in a lease. And this is about the first step in the security deposit procedure. Like at the end of a lease, the tenant has to notify the landlord within 4 days after moving out of a forwarding address. Otherwise, the tenant loses a lot of rights under the security deposit law. The security deposit law also says that the landlord must use inventory checklists. And I have rarely used there because I have rarely seen inventory checklists in all of the tenancies that I've seen, hundreds, thousands, and I don't know how often they're actually used, but it is the best practice. And it is for the protection of the tenants. And tenants moving in and doing a move-in checklist have the right to see the last inventory checklist, the move-out checklist of the prior tenant, so that they can see, what was wrong when the last person moved out. But the security deposit law does have this strict timeline for, telling the landlord that you're leaving and that that you've got a forwarding address. And then once the landlord has a forwarding address, they have 30 days to tell you about whether they're withholding any of your security deposit for damages. And then you have 7 days to respond. And the landlord has 45 days to file a lawsuit against you. But it's all in there. It's a little bit in the weeds. But one of the important things to know about the law is that if the landlord improperly fails to return the security deposit, then the landlord might be liable to the tenant for double the amount of the security deposit. Late fees. Late fees must be reasonably related to the damages suffered by the landlord. So we see this a lot too, where our sort of in our heads internal standard for what's a reasonable late fee on a monthly basis might be about $50 or so. And we think that the judges in Washtenaw pretty much agree with us. That might go up to 75 or 80. But the law, Michigan law, case law, says that late fees must be reasonably related to the damages suffered by the landlord. So like if you paid your $500 or say $1,000 a month rent late and say it was 15 days late, what is the real harm to the landlord of having received that money late? And, we've argued that, look, it's just, not having that money for 15 days, 30 days, 60 days, whatever, might be equivalent to the interest that you've lost from not having that. Maybe the administrative costs of trying to collect the late fees, but it's certainly not, $100 a month or more. And I'll say that, and I just added this because I just saw this lease yesterday, which blew my mind, a handwritten lease by a solo landlord who said the late fee is $25 a day for every it's late after the 6th of the month. And so this is a guy who filed a case, a landlord who filed a case who said, oh, the tenant owes maybe about $6,000 in rent and $11,000 in late fees. And it just blew my mind. It was really outrageous. So I just wanted to say, yeah, not every late fee provision is that outrageous, but they can be pretty onerous and not reasonably related to the harm or the damages that are suffered by the landlord. Okay. early termination of leases. I know that this is a question that has come up for some folks. And, you know, because the lease is a written agreement between the parties, it's usually subject to whatever's written in the lease. And the court will abide by that. And there are some landlords who write in, if you terminate early, we're going to charge you an early termination fee, you know, $500 or $1,000. Now going back to that provision in the Truth in Renting Act, the landlord is not allowed to say, if you leave early and you break your lease, I'm going to charge you for all of the rent that you agreed to pay through the end of the lease. So like if you leave after 6 months and it's a 12-month lease, the landlord cannot say automatically in a blanket way, okay, you owe for the last 6 months too, and I'm going to charge you that and get a judgment against you for that. What the landlord can do is it can do a reasonable estimate of what their damages would be if you moved out early. And I have seen this in a lot of big landlords leases that says, if you move out early, $500 or $1,000. And that's their calculation of the expense to them of having to relet an apartment that they thought they were going to have filled for a full 12 months. And I've seen the courts uphold those. But, you know, you should know of this concept called the landlord's duty to mitigate damages. If someone moves out early, say after 6 months on a 12-month lease, then the landlord has the duty to make its best efforts to relet the apartment. And thereby, like if they get someone in the next month or two, and, you know, they can't say that I was hurt by not having rent for the last 4 months of this lease because they got that rent. So that's the concept of mitigating damages. There is in Michigan law a couple of exceptions to, you know, requiring people to stay through the end of their leases. And one of them is if senior citizens transition to senior citizen housing or can no longer live independently. And the other is protection for folks who are victims of domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking. And those are, the requirements are for those are pretty well spelled out in the law. Okay, and that was my quick summary, and this is the resource page where I'm talking about where you can go to get some legal advice about particular cases or leases. Of course, Michigan Legal Help. If you can afford to pay a private lawyer, or if you can even just afford the $30 fee for a half-an-hour consult with a private lawyer through the Washtenaw Bar Association, you can call the lawyer's referral service with the number there. And then for us, Legal Services in South Central Michigan, I put up some sort of general email addresses where you can send in some inquiries there. And I put up our main number. And just wanted to caution you right now, because we're being swamped with the eviction diversion stuff, we're not taking directly calls about new cases. And those are being routed to our hotline. Our call hotline, the Counsel and Advocacy Law line, is staffed by lawyers. And so if you call our main number, it'll let you like dial, I think it's 3 or something to reach call. And on the call line, you get put on hold until a lawyer becomes available to talk to you. But then you get to talk to a real lawyer directly about a case, and they do the screening and intake for us. And they'll send cases back to us if they're within our priorities. And then that last one there is a link for information about the University of Michigan Law School clinics. This is the perfect time. If you have a case, you'll have, there are a bunch of different kinds of law school clinics, but the big ones that we refer cases to are the General Civil Criminal Litigation Clinic, the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic, and the Veterans Clinic. And so those folks, because it's the beginning of the semester, they've got a bunch of eager students who want to work on these cases, and they've got some great, really experienced professors supervising them. It's a great source of legal help and a supplement to us to handle a lot of the cases that we just, because of our resource limitations, aren't able to handle.
Tish, there's been lots of questions in the chat.
Okay.
I've been answering them as we go, but folks are saying, you know, there are landlords who say they do not allow tenants to break the lease. So what, and I've, yeah, so that, and I have said, you know, landlords cannot physically stop tenants from leaving the unit.
Mhm.
Once you turn in keys, you've tendered possession, but can you maybe reiterate what you were saying earlier about what does it mean when a landlord says they are not, that a tenant is not allowed to break the lease? What is that?
Yeah, so that is kind of an odd thing, because what does the landlord mean when they say the tenant's not allowed to break the lease? They don't want the tenant to break the lease, and they might have legal remedies if a tenant breaks the lease, but they cannot stop a tenant from physically leaving. So I am just going to stop the screen sharing, and let's see. Yeah, so yeah, I think my question would be, what does the landlord mean by that? I think, you know, I think that the tenant needs to be aware that there are legal consequences for breaking a lease. And, you know, we don't generally encourage people to break leases, and we don't help people break leases. But, you know, if it falls, for instance, if it falls under one of these categories of people who are protected by the law, people who are subject to domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking, or people who are seniors who can't live in their place anymore. Those are the kinds of you know, situations where, yeah, you have to push back on the landlord and say, no, under the law, Michigan law protects these folks and they can leave. And the landlord always has the duty to mitigate the damages if a tenant wants to leave early. And then there might be situations where, you know, the landlord is breaching the lease. Maybe the landlord's not making the repairs they're supposed to. And I think that in those cases, you know, the tenants would have a good reason and a good defense for the landlord trying to impose penalties on them for terminating early.
So in the chat, Jesse says, landlord says they will not accept a key or a 30-day notice or anything from anyone and will just keep their lease active until 3 months of no payment, and then they will go through eviction.
You know, I'd like to know who this landlord is, but
it rhymes with eel.
you have to do everything in writing. I'm sorry, did you say who it was?
That it rhymes with eel.
Oh. Yeah, I'd say document everything in writing. And, you know, I don't know what your client's reason is for leaving early, but if there's a good reason for it, I think that also needs to be documented and conveyed to the landlord. And, you know, take a good look at the terms of the lease and see what it says about that. But yeah, if you need to leave, you need to leave.
Remember to, I forget this, Mike, you know, this is going to go before a court. A landlord is not the final decision maker about what landlord-tenant law is or should be. So a landlord can say wild things and refuse to take keys back. But if a tenant goes to court and is like, Your Honor, I tried a bajillion times to return the keys and was told repeatedly no. And fortunately, I got it in writing because I was smart. Or I mailed it to them, you know, return receipt requested, and they mailed it back to me. And here it is. You know, the court is not going to say that a tenant, like, it doesn't work to be like, no, I won't touch it. So I didn't accept possession back. It's like service of a document, you know, just because, you know, if a court server comes to serve me with, like, I don't know, divorce papers, and I refuse to touch the papers, they leave them there. I don't get to pretend that I didn't get the documents. That doesn't work in court. The court will still ask what was a reasonable amount of time to relet the property. You know, how many months did it take, or should it have taken? If the landlord sat on their hands and did nothing for 12 months, well, that's not a reasonable effort to relet the property. The part that gets squishy is, well, what's reasonable, right? Did they advertise it? Did they do the normal stuff? And did it take 2 months to relet the property? Well, then maybe if the landlord has managed to file a new lawsuit against this tenant, which means they found them, they had to find their address to serve them, and they've initiated the lawsuit, which is a step they have to take, right? These are the things a landlord has to do to collect on unpaid rent once a tenant has left.
Yeah, and the caveat to that is you probably also want to warn the client to watch out for the non-judicial consequences of leaving a lease early. You know, they could send a collector after the person. They could report negative things on their credit history. And, you know, that's a whole other topic here. But, you know, on credit reports, if, you know, people need to sort of periodically check those. And if there's erroneous stuff on there, they have the right to challenge it. But yeah, there could be other things that are really annoying that arise out of that.
That's true. That's true. What else? Did we miss anything?
So we're about
Out
5
of time.
minutes over, so I think we might have to wrap up this portion. This has been so amazing. I learned a ton, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you so much, Tish and Callie. This was just wonderful. I'm sure people's gears are still turning. So is there a way they can continue to ask questions beyond the resources? Michigan Legal Help, I heard that one loud and clear.
Yeah, so I field questions from folks pretty regularly, and I apologize, you know, folks who have emailed me know sometimes I just can't get back to you, and, you know, as quickly as I'd like, but I am happy to be a resource to folks. My email was I'll put it in here again. But I think Tisha's right, you know, the first place to go is probably Michigan Legal Help. And then there's also Counsel and Advocacy Law Line, the telephonic advice and intake hotline that she mentioned is where we're going to be sending cases. So clients can call that and get advice. Like, they may have to wait on hold for a little bit, but that is a way to get immediate responses, because we just don't have the capability, right? So I really am always happy to talk through sticky stuff, strategy stuff, especially, but for more basic information, I'd say you can start with Michigan Legal Help. And let me give you, Counsel and Advocacy Law Line there's actually a link on Michigan Legal Help with their information. So let me give you that link as well. Tish, anything?
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Callie. That's exactly, you know, and I occasionally field inquiries too from folks in the community and our partners, but like Callie said, we are just so swamped these days that it might take us a couple days or a few days to get back to folks. And if you need a quicker response, yeah, call is a great resource. Michigan Legal Help is a great resource. And those general emails that I put, you really think that this is something that we need to handle, that's a priority, you can try, you know, we have our legal assistants monitor this general inquiry. I'll put it in the chat email. So that's another way to try to reach us. But it's yeah, it's we try to prioritize as best we can, and let us know if there's something urgent that you need.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thank you both so much. We're running a little behind schedule. I don't think that's super surprising with a 3-hour training. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And then Aubrey and David, I know you guys are up next. Please don't feel like you need to shorten your material. You know, I'm sure folks can manage if they have to stay on a little longer, and if they can't, we'll have it recorded. So thanks so much. We'll see everybody at 11:15.
Hey, everyone. Should I go ahead and get started, Andrew? Okay, you can hear me. And do you see the PowerPoint? Okay. Who else loves split screens as little as I do? Greetings. Good morning. My name is Aubrey Patino. I'm the Executive Director of Avalon Housing. I just want to say thanks to Tish and Callie, who are American treasures, and we are lucky to have them in our community. Like them, I have also been tasked to give you far too much information and far too little time. So I'm breaking a lot of cardinal rules today. I put way too many things on slides. It's not participatory. And I tried to think about this through the context of how can I give you tools to maybe kind of go back and learn more about in lieu of how could you learn housing-based case management in 25 minutes? So I just want to ground us in that and acknowledge that this is, well, we're taking a harm reduction approach to training. Okay, so, oh, no, that doesn't work. So how do I, oh, beautiful. Okay, there we go. So housing-based case management, generally speaking, is predicated upon the following. Services are highly individualized. So everyone that we serve, they have different needs, right? And so we have to be flexible and capable of expanding and contracting alongside those needs. They are flexible and ideally ongoing. I recognize a lot of us may be working in settings where an ongoing relationship is not an option, but ideally we are able to provide services as needed in perpetuity, or are linking and referring people to the services that they may need for the long haul. They are outreach based, meaning generally speaking, the folks that we're working with do require assertive outreach and engagement. Generally speaking, when services are voluntary and people have had historically negative experiences with social services providers, our efficacy in that relationship is really predicated upon our ability to skillfully outreach and engage people in community in their home. And then they're harm reduction oriented. And so what I mean by that is that we are able to sort of articulate rights and responsibilities with people, as well as lease obligations, but that continued participation, right, in working with us is not sort of predicated upon whether or not people are engaging in high risk behavior, but are they adhering to those lease expectations? And then if not, how are we going to support them through that process? And then, you know, that we explore the benefits of changing, reducing, eliminating high risk behavior by providing accurate and balanced information that neither sort of minimizes or exaggerates potential consequences of those behaviors. And then continually and collaboratively defining and redefining what success means with folks, and whose goals are we working on? Their goals, right? So keeping that at the forefront of our working relationship with people. Key components of housing-based case management, you know, outreach and engagement, can't say enough about that. In support of housing model, it absolutely needs to be in person. You know, certainly that may change or adapt as people's needs change or adapt, but we learn a lot by meeting people in community, seeing them in their homes. And often it's the case that you can't replicate that through sort of a telehealth approach. One of the models that I learned very early on as a street outreach worker in Seattle was developed by this guy who's a mental health chaplain. His name's Craig Redenbaum, and it's called the Relational Stages of Outreach and Engagement. And I find it's incredibly helpful to think about what stage of engagement are you in with someone as you sort of calibrate how you're going to approach them. So I link this later, and hopefully these resources can get shared out, but he talks about those stages as approach, companionship, partnership, and then mutuality. Assessment and action planning is really important. Ideally, at Avalon, our parameter is that we're really working to try to do a comprehensive assessment with someone within their first 30 days of move-in. And out of that, we're developing an action plan in partnership with them Ideally, you're focusing on, say, 1 to 3 things that are really going to help that person's quality of life and promote housing stability. What we find happens when we don't stay focused on that plan and on those kind of rocks, if you will, if you want to use the analogy of pebbles, sand, and rocks, is that we become crisis workers, and that happens very quickly. So while crisis intervention is certainly a component of the work and sometimes is a bit inevitable with the challenges that people are facing, we want to make sure that we stay the course on how do we get upstream and intervene on some of the drivers of those crises. And then, as you all know, lots of creative problem solving and advocacy. The level of creativity I see us all employing in this work is extraordinary, and it is required. And then lastly, community building. So thinking about ways that we're helping people to build in community supports and network abundance, and how critical that feels now more than ever, as we have all kind of, I think, as years go on, we're sort of tasked to be more and more efficient. Our working relationships with people are shorter. The resources we have are less on the services side. So we do really need to help people build those networks of support around them. Also, it's critical that we address isolation when people are in housing, as that can often be a catalyst for their lack of well-being when they are hyper isolated. The point of this slide is to just sort of acknowledge that all of types of different services are provided in housing-based case management. As you know, many of you, it'd probably be easier to say what we don't do. That said, we can't one person, necessarily do all of this. So thinking about how do we help to kind of refer and link to appropriate community-based services that can provide these supports. I wanted to just throw this up there because I know that not all of us have the opportunity to provide more permanent support to people. So one really helpful model that exists, it's an evidence-based model. It's called critical time intervention. Some of you may be very versed in this or are using it. This can be a great option, say, in rapid rehousing. It was developed actually initially out of lots of people getting housed out of chronic homelessness in New York City. And then eventually it became a model for when people were released from longer term institutional care. But basically oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Hey, Aubrey, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think you're referring to slides, and all we see is the video.
That's terrible. This whole time.
So sorry. Yeah, I sent you a chat, but I
can't multitask, so I don't see that.
No, it's so okay. You were just on a roll. I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, that I do that. So I actually don't know how to fix that. Let me stop sharing. And then now my slides are gone entirely. Hang on. Oh. Sorry, everybody. You just missed a lot of helpful information that wasn't coming out of their mouth, but we'll get that to you. Okay. So, and so then let's see. So do you see this now? Do you see it now? Or do you just see the video?
We saw the slides, but we do see the video now.
You see the video now. Why?
The slides were there.
You had it, Aubrey. You just
not sure.
You did before.
Well, when I moved it, I mean, this is just ridiculous. I'm sorry. I am like the least tech savvy elder millennial on the planet.
We got this right.
But then we're gonna do. Okay, so now we have to, so you don't just like see it. So now is it still there?
Yay, there it is.
Gosh, thanks for your grace. Okay. So CTI, I'll just say, focuses on, 3 phases. And what is helpful about this intervention is that it tends to be 7 to 9 months long. And the whole time you're preparing the person for exiting the service relationship. So, we are informed by CTI at Avalon, but this isn't necessarily applicable in our work. I just wanted to offer that as a resource. I encourage you all to learn more. There are tons of resources out there and lots of good training and whatnot. I'm happy to recommend trainers if that's of interest. Okay, so now, darn it. Yep, okay, great. So I'm like, I'm gonna have to go out of this, you guys. This is just not working out. Okay, so I'm just gonna do this if that's okay. Is that cool? Thank you. Okay, so the other thing that is foundational for us is motivational interviewing, and we do put a good degree of emphasis on MI here at Avalon. It is important in that it provides a way for us to assess where someone's at in their change process to then help them identify their readiness and motivation to address challenges and set goals. I'm sure many of you have had exposure to MI, and I would encourage you to continue to sort of expand that toolbox. It is in alignment with our values. Because we acknowledge the client is the expert in their situation, and that we have an opportunity to play a role in helping them move along the change process by offering up safe and non-judgmental space to explore change and then potential risk and behavior. And it invites people to kind of examine their own values, right, and behaviors and come up with their own reasons to change. So we know that the people we work with already have what they need, and together we have to help them sort of find that. And, this is not something like I can train you on today, obviously, but also just will say that we've had a fun journey over the years of kind of how to get trained on MI and how to support one another and our skills around that. So we have MI learning circles, and we do MI on each other, and ways that we've tried to really implement training around this internally that I'd be happy to share more about. So these are the goals of motivational interviewing, right? That we understand thought processes related to problem, that we can identify and measure the kind of emotional reactions to that. And then how thoughts and feelings are interacting to produce behavior patterns and challenging those in ways that are really respectful, but can help motivate people intrinsically. Also, one of the great things about MI is that you can do an MI intervention in less than 5 minutes sometimes. So someone can be in a state of crisis, and you can, say something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to fill in the blank by Wednesday? And that can really ground them and then facilitate a conversation that sort of moves things into a different direction. So encourage this as helpful foundational content that you seek out further if that's not already a big part of your model of care. I would be remiss not to say something about trauma-informed care and how that plays a role in what we do, all of us. And we know that obviously the experience of homelessness is a traumatic one, and that many people that we work with have pretty complex trauma histories. And we want to ensure that we are operating in a way that takes that into account. So, you see my notes, but stand in awe about what people carry instead of judgment about how they carry it. And I'm going to show you this really quick video clip that you saw for a long time. And this is just only 4 minutes of it. Being cognizant of time, encourage you to watch the whole video. And now you can't hear it.
Think about that. It's a pretty profound image, isn't it? I think that speaks to the power of those early experiences and literally wiring the brain. So these profound negative experiences are so powerful and weighty that the good experiences that happen later in life, while important and needed, just simply cannot easily unbalance the early experiences. And so what do we think about that? We often think that people can't heal, or that they're resistant to heal, or they're not amenable to our services, because we've built a behavioral health system and we espouse treatments that are more and more short-term. Developmental trauma cannot be healed in the short term. It takes time. Now, the sad reality too is that many of the people that most need our help are the most difficult to engage. And so it begs the question, do people with traumatized brains have to get better before we can help them? Makes us uncomfortable to contemplate that. And yet the answer might be yes, if we persist in holding on to our traditional toolboxes. But the answer should be a resounding no. Never have we known more about how to heal trauma after decades of research in trauma, attachment, and brain science. We don't know it all, but we've never had more information and more hope about what to do in helping access and calm brains so that they can then make use of the services that we already have. Now, some of you may be sitting there and thinking, wow, good luck with that, to those of us in the human service field. And clearly, we've got a lot of work to do. But my message today is bigger than that, because trauma affects us all. You have only to look at the work being done by the Center for Disease Control on the Adverse Childhood Event Study that show the profound effect of childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is demonstrated to be not only the most powerful predictor of the things you might guess, like anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicide. Childhood trauma is the single most powerful predictor of a host of chronic medical illnesses like cardiac disease. So much so that many researchers now say that childhood trauma is the single most profound public health crisis in our country. What do we do about that? Well, clearly in the human service field, we have our work, but we as a community have work to do too. I would ask you to think back to the core of childhood trauma. It happens in the crucible of those powerful relationships. So many people say the hurt happened in the relationship, and it takes new relationships to promote healing. The thing is, we can never predict which relationship might be the catalyst that sets a person on a path to healing. It might be a teacher, it might be a coach, it might be a neighbor, a cop, it might be any one of us. So I would ask you to take from this message the idea that we are all impacted by trauma. We are all paying the cost, whether personal or societal. We help people heal when we promote connection to one another and connection back into our communities. That's how we heal the future. So being trauma informed is something that we all have an interest in. Thank you.
Okay. Do you see the slideshow? So I just show that video because I think it can feel particularly overwhelming for any of us who are called to have shorter term working relationships with people who are experiencing a lot of complex challenges. And we're primarily focused on getting them housed, keeping them housed. And you know, maybe there are all these clinical interventions out there, but what really heals is the relationship. And I appreciate her emphasis on that. And that has certainly proven to be the case. And so many folks that we've had the privilege of working with over the years as we see them stabilize and thrive. So I just want to encourage us all to stay grounded in that and remember how important it is. In terms of sort of trauma-informed care at an organizational level, you know, I want to just touch on some key things. So safety, obviously being a big one, and I'll acknowledge that I think all of us aspire towards embodying these principles, but none of us perhaps do them to the degree that we might want. And it is just ongoing work that we all have to sort of continue to emphasize at an org level. So people feel safe physically and psychologically, that organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency and the goal of building and maintaining trust among all, including clients. The emphasis on peer support and mutual self-help are integral to the service delivery approach. In terms of collaboration, sort of mutuality, that there's true partnering and leveling of power differences between staff and clients. And then empowerment, voice, and choice, you know, that the organization emphasizes individual strengths, resilience, and that staff, client, and family member experience of choice are recognized as unique and requiring an individualized approach. And then taking into account cultural, historical, racial, and gender issues in our care, and in the way that we create an employee experience that helps to support people from less of a place of sort of diversity and more of a place of inclusion and belonging. So what is distinctly unique about housing-based case management? This is a question for you all. Should you want to throw something in the chat or you want to say something, you're welcome to just unmic. It's not a trick question. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and acknowledge that we here talk about how what is distinctly different about housing-based case management is that we want to try to use the lease to structure the work. So our primary goal is that people stay stably housed. In order to do so, they do have to understand how to manage the obligations of their tenancy. That does require active coordination between property manager, landlord, and then us, right, as services folks in the context of that role. But there has to be a separation of those functions because we don't want A, to create an alternate reality, and B, I don't want my landlord to know about all sorts of things about my life, right? So just normalizing that. Also, how can we, back to kind of the MI piece of things, potentially use tenancy issues as motivation for change. So, to state the obvious, property management has a role in helping people understand obligations and compliance with lease, and services staff provide services that help them to maintain housing and function as the advocate for the tenant. It can be challenging. Tension between property management and supportive services staff is very natural, and often within that conflict, a lot of creativity and resolve can occur. But fostering a collaborative partnership matters, even in the private landlord market, even with landlords who we may not always find favorable. When we can have that relational capital, it can serve the individual we're working with when the time comes. So, basic, what are the responsibilities of landlord, property manager? What are the responsibilities of folks who are in a case management role? And what are the distinct differences between those? There are lots of common pitfalls that happen. There can be differences in beliefs about the approach, inconsistent enforcement of the lease, unclear communication, right? Tenant dissatisfaction with the quality of housing or the quality of maybe the services they're receiving from us. So lots of areas for tension and conflict. And I think much of how these things are resolved is predicated upon good and over communication between all parties involved. What's really hard is that we work with people who we are often asked to kind of prioritize what is the well-being of the community versus this tenant or household, and how do we keep in context that someone might perhaps have lease compliance issues, but if those issues aren't impacting others in the community, is there a way for us to negotiate that they continue to maintain tenancy? And thinking a lot about what does it mean to have sort of tenant choice in everything, including their relationship with us, but then maintaining proactive engagement so that we're not intervening when things have reached a point of crisis and there's no relationship in place prior. So I threw this like wild case study out and then I'm almost done. It sounds like totally overwhelming, and it is, but also it's real. So I'll quickly read it to you and then we can maybe throw out a couple ideas, but I know we're running low on time, so I'll make it quick. A maintenance technician has repeatedly entered a unit that's currently unfit for human habitation due to hoarding and cat and fecal matter, pet stuff happening everywhere. The state of this is like really weighing heavily on the maintenance tech. They both don't feel like the tenant should be living in these conditions, and they're also frustrated, feeling like no one's doing anything about it. Tenant isn't really able to address these issues on their own. The unit condition is kind of worse than ever post-pandemic. In addition to all of that, tenant hasn't been paying rent and is under eviction for non-payment. And the property manager knows that a SIRA application's been done, but they don't have a status update. They're frustrated. Meanwhile, the case manager has been working with all the systems of care, hospital and CMH and police intervention to try to help this person. And so, you know, what can each party do in a situation like this? What are folks' roles? And I think just in the context of what we talked about earlier, and then how do we identify where there's confusion or disagreement, and what can we do moving forward? So you're welcome to unmic, say something, put something in the chat, and then I'll just offer some suggestions as well. I'm just going to count to 7 in my head before I start talking. Okay, so seeing nothing, I'll just say that the thing I want to emphasize here is that no one person involved in this case can do any of it alone, right? So all parties should be actively communicating with one another. In an ideal scenario, they're all really working together with, of course, the tenant's permission, and they're working on an eviction prevention plan. You know, maybe there's a housing kind of stabilization case conferencing that's occurring, and a real kind of division of labor, but that there's someone is asserting themselves, ideally the housing-based case manager. I'm being lead with communicating out what's going on. You know, we're working on the unit cleanup. Here's the status on the SIRA application, you know, making sure that even down to the maintenance tech, people understand that this is being addressed. And that's also part of how we maintain a trauma-informed environment for that maintenance tech, right? I put this out there because it's complicated and difficult, and it seems extreme, but it's also a live example. And to acknowledge that there are also needs here that extend beyond the housing-based case manager, landlord, maintenance, right? And well into all of us and systems of care in the community that need to be brought into this person's situation for them to have sustainable help that helps to stabilize these issues. Okay, so that was like way too much, too fast with tech problems on a Friday morning, but thanks for rolling with me. I just want to remind us, you know, housing is a platform for recovery. And what are we here to accomplish? You know, we do frame our sort of how we look at our services and evaluate what we're doing based on the dimensions of quality that CSH has. So folks are staying housed. What is our housing retention rate? People are happy with what they're getting. Hopefully they're improving income, employment, having meaningful daytime activity, improving physical and mental health, and then that social and community connectedness. And then I just want to share some resources with you all, some of which you may be using or really familiar with. Org Code has free stuff that not all of which I find helpful, but these particular resources are quite helpful. The Honest Monthly Budget, great tool, highly recommend it. Their guest policy, that can be a really nice way to work with someone around that conversation as it relates to guest issues. They have a sample crisis plan as well, which is helpful. And then the relational outreach and engagement model that I referenced in the CSH dimensions of quality. Okay, that's all for me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing, get myself out of that. We're way over on time. Oh, okay, I see one comment. So, okay, so, yeah. Yeah, I think that part of how we can maybe navigate something like that. So the comment is around what are the boundaries of the working relationship when you're so focused on housing stabilization and you want to stay housing focused. And I think, you know, I'll just say, like, as a sector, we have to be a little bit cautious because we have had a bit of a slippery slope around, you know, we can sort of throw a lot of services at people, but if we're not if the primary focus isn't on getting them housed and keeping them housed, then all of that is rendered somewhat meaningless. So I think, how do you integrate those things that someone is sharing into the housing conversation, and try to maintain that information, as sometimes that information helps you understand the drivers of someone's housing instability, and there might be ways that you can address that so that you're playing kind of a role in prevention around housing destabilization moving forward. But that's also why it's really important to be very candid with folks up front about, like, what is the nature of our working relationship? What are our goals together? What are we working on? And then centering back on that when things do start to go in different directions. And maybe that's someone who might benefit from referral or linkage to other resources. I say that knowing it's really hard to find other resources that are meaningful and can meet people's needs, but it's tricky. Thanks, y'all. The last thing I'll say is there are no predictors of housing success. So I know we all want to convince ourselves that that's the case, but I assure you it's not. We don't know. And so we have to try with everyone. And I know you all do that every day. And I just want to thank you for that. And I appreciate you giving me grace with my lack of tech savvy, which is always a thing, I tell you. It's like some kind of a glitch up here. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm up. So I know we're running kind of short on time, but if you can, I really encourage you to stick around, because I think this is a really cool program that I'm going to share a little bit with you guys about. So my name is David Kahana. I'm the diversion coordinator over at the Shelter Association. Our pilot diversion program for Washtenaw CoC started in January. So I'm going to be giving an update on what that's been looking like at CoC. First, I want to quickly review what diversion is, because I know it's been about 2 years since my supervisor, Kate DeLessio, first spoke about diversion with the CoC. So diversion is a strategy that prevents homelessness for people seeking shelter by helping them identify immediate alternative housing arrangements, and if necessary, connecting them with services and financial assistance to help them return to permanent housing. A couple things that are important to note here. For one, diversion is not in any way meant to be a barrier to shelter. It's a completely optional program. The other thing is that diversion is not for everybody. Typically works best for folks who have relatively low barriers to housing, and I'll go over that just a little bit. So there's kind of 3 C's regarding best practices for diversion. The first is commitment. Diversion, like I said, is an alternative to the shelter system. We ideally want shelter to be available to those with the highest needs and as a last resort. We want to avoid over-serving within the homeless system, and there's many people who only need just a little bit of help to get out of homelessness, and that's the purpose that diversion serves. The second is conversation. Diversion is a problem-solving, strengths-based conversation. It's not an assessment tool with a set list of questions. The third is creativity. We want to help clients think of creative solutions and really explore every option that's available to them. So in terms of the actual diversion process, it can be broken down into 9 steps. I'm going to go ahead and simplify that today to just 3. The first is an explanation of diversion. The second is a strengths-based conversation. And the third is problem solving. So when someone comes to the Delana Center to get their initial assessment, this is when we'll implement this process. CoC's diversion coordinator, me, is also able to work with clients who are referred to us from other agencies who haven't gotten an assessment yet. So for step 1, explanation of diversion, this has a couple purposes within CoC's diversion program. One is to temper expectations about the timing and about the conditions of shelter. Some folks are surprised that shelter will typically not be available the same day that they do their assessment. It can be days, it can be weeks before they're actually able to get a bed with us. This is not true during warming center when people can obviously walk in whenever they need to, But the conditions may be slightly different than what they're expecting. Clients are sleeping on a mat on the floor. For some folks, that is truly a deal breaker, and they will want to explore other options. The other purpose is to explain to the client that CoC's priority is to get them housed as quickly as possible, and that we may be able to find them somewhere to stay by talking with them about their housing history and their current situation. So if they are interested in engaging with that, we move on to the strengths-based conversation. And what we're looking for are clients who have few barriers to housing and for whom traditional case management may be excessive. For instance, the client may already have documentation, income, and even a place lined up. They simply need assistance with their deposit. Alternatively, a client with no income yet may have some family in the area that they could stay with while they're working on building up that income and that housing plan. So the conversation is realistically led as much as possible by the client themselves, and it's meant to take as much time as the client needs. We're looking for personal strengths that could get the client rapidly housed. Most often that strength comes from the client's own personal network of friends and family. We found that many clients do have an existing support network, but a barrier in their relationship has left the client feeling helpless and like they need to access shelter. Frequently, clients tell me that the only reason they don't want to reach out to their support network is simply because they don't want to burden them. So we really want to empower them through this conversation to really think about their options. So once we've identified some options and some barriers, we want to move on to problem solving. It's time to break through those barriers. This can be accomplished in numerous ways, but most often at CoC, it comes down to 4. That's mediation, incentives for family and friends like grocery carts, travel expenses, and move-in cost assistance. For these, flexible funding is really, really important. Obviously, if someone has a place that they can get into and they're just missing out on their deposit, we don't want them to have to spend the night on the street because they couldn't access that right away. So that's a little bit about process and best practices. And I'd like to move straight along to some of our statistics, which I love looking at. So over at CoC, 33% of the folks who access our program are diverted to family or friends. 15% of those are diverted to their own housing, and 51% are not diverted. Of those who are not diverted, most will move on to our residential or non-residential case management. I'd also really like to shout out CoC here because we're working very closely with them on this diversion project. And CoC has diverted 56 families since January, which translates to a pretty incredible 180 people from homelessness. And that's 65% of all the people who access their program. Over at CoC, nearly half of our diversions are to permanent housing situations, as you can see. Let's move that along. This figure I really love. So you can see this is the average cost at CoC to house a client through a traditional shelter stay. It costs around $4,700, which is not a small number, and we house quite a few people. If you look very carefully, you'll see that there's actually another bar over here, and that's how much it costs to divert somebody to housing. I know it's easy to miss. So that's only $176 to divert someone who could have just as easily ended up in the traditional shelter program and would have been essentially overserved. It's also important to note that that $176 is only the clients that we have spent money to divert. 35% of the people that we divert, we do it for free. It does not cost anything. I'll note that the most expensive intervention is move-in cost assistance, and that has been less frequent. We would expect that as we help more and more folks with move-in cost assistance, that number will climb a bit, but obviously the traditional shelter stay will still eclipse it. So if you'd like to learn more about the diversion program, or if you have any feedback, I would love to hear from you. My info's right up there. If you want to refer a client to us for diversion, you can scan that QR code right there. It'll take you directly to our diversion referral form. If for whatever reason you don't have a smartphone or you're unable to do that, my contact info is right up there. Feel free to get in touch and I will work with you as quickly as I can. Thank you. I can take any questions that we have. All right, let me check the chat. Cool. All right, well, thanks again, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. Thank you to everyone who presented today. We appreciate all of your time in putting your presentations together. And we also appreciate everyone who attended for being here. We had a wonderful turnout. We had almost over 70 people at one point today. So that was just fantastic. We will post the recording of this training on our website, the OCED website, and Andrew is also going to circulate the slides from the presenters, so you have those at your disposal for reference for any of the information that was presented today. Any last minute thoughts or questions before we depart? Okay, well, thank you again. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Thank you.